Christy here for Sunny Studio Stamps, and today I'm going to be making a card using Little Buckaroo's Farm Fresh and Harvest Mice. So I've stamped out my images on Nina Solar White cardstock with Memento Rich Cocoa ink. I wanted to do kind of a softer style of coloring today, and I thought this brown ink would suit that well. So I'm coloring with my Copic markers, and I'm starting with my little girl. For her skin, I'm going to use E00, E02, and E11. So I'm starting with that E11 and doing a little shadow on her face, on the sides, and up under her hairline. I'm also coloring in her ears and giving a little shadow on her arms and her knees, and then blending that out with the E02. And then I'm going to fill in any white space that's left with that E00. And then I'm going to grab the R20 while that ink is still wet and add a little bit of blush to her cheeks. And then I'll go back with my E00 to soften that in. While I had those colors out, I also did the corn husk and the goat's horns and the inside of its ears. And now I'm moving on to the little girl's hair. For that, I'm using E51, E53, and E55. And while I like to color darkest to lightest for most things, with hair I actually do the opposite. So I'm starting with that E51 and laying in where I eventually want my shadows to go, and then building that up with the E53, and then finally getting to my darkest, that E55. And then I will blend everything out in the reverse. And I prefer to do it for hair just because it's not something that I'm super confident in. I'm still learning, and so it's easier to start light and build up that way if it's something that you're just not sure of. It's a lot easier to build up to the dark than it is to take it away. So I'm moving on to her little cowgirl hat now with W00, W1, and W3. I'm going to lay in some shadow with that W3 on the underside of the brim, and then I'm going to begin to add some shadows that are just going to accentuate that bowed shape. So once I have that laid in, I will begin to blend that out with the W1. I'm going to make the shadow pretty deep on the underside of that brim just because it would be cast in a lot of shadow, but I'll definitely leave more white space on the top for that highlighted shade. So once I have that all filled in, I'm going to also color in her little vest with those shades. I thought we would have a little matching outfit here. So I'm just adding a little darkness at the top underneath her shoulders and bandana, and a little along the sides, and blending toward the center. And I also colored in her belt buckle with that W3. I'm going to color in the goat's beard and the hair on top of his head with these three shades. And then for the rest of his body, I'm going to take away the W00 and add in the W5. So with that darkest color, I'm going to add a little shadow to his ears and up under his hair, and then a little bit down the left side of his face, a tiny bit on the right as well, but more on the left since he's facing right. And then down at the bottom of his fur, I'm going to do some large flicking motions because I want him to look really nice and shaggy. And then I'm going to start to blend that out with the W3. Now, because I stamped my images in brown ink, I do have to be careful not to color over the eyes or they're not going to look brown anymore. So just carefully going around those and then continuing those large flicks to make his coat so just a little bit more rough textured. And then I also added a little bit of that W3 on his legs. And then I'm filling in the rest of that white space with the W1. And I will bring that down on his legs as well to finish those out. And then I'll use those shades to color in the little girl's cowboy boots, just adding a little shadow on the inside of her legs and a little bit on the top there, and then blending out with the W3 and the W1, and then filling in the goat's hooves with that W5. For her dress, I'm using R11, R12, and R20. And I'm starting with that R20 down on the skirt and adding a shadow right up under her belt and under her vest. And then I filled in that little part above the belt with the R20 as well. And then I'm pulling that out with the R12 on her skirt and filling in with the R11. I'm also going to do her hat band to match, so starting with the R20 on the outside edges and blending toward the center with each of those other two shades. I'll color the inside of her mouth with the R11 and then do her tongue with the R20. And then I'm also going to color my pumpkins with these two shades. I wanted to have a very simple, soft, feminine color palette today. So I'm just sticking to pink, gray, yellow, and tan. That's it. So I had to get creative with some of my images, but it kind of helps me think outside the box, and I really like how it turned out. So my final shade is yellow. I'm using Y000, Y11, and Y13 to color in the little girl's bandana and also the corn on the cob. And then for my background panel, I'm actually going to keep things extremely simple. I'm going to use one marker, the E000, and I'm going to just add a little bit of color here and there to just draw your eye in. So I'm going to do some flicking motions from the bottom edge of the barn, and then I'm also going to bring that color in on either side of the grass. I will color in some of the windmill, just really simple coloring. It's really just to kind of draw your eye in and help you focus on different things and keep things very soft and dreamy. But this is a really cool way to use some of these background images if you don't feel like coloring them in every time. I definitely love to do that too. I colored this one in on my last video using Sunny Studios stamps, but this time I just wanted to give you guys a different look. So I added a little bit of color between those fence rails, and now I'm flicking a little color into the sky as well. And what that's going to do is make the places that I left white really stand out and look even more white. I'm going to grab my colorless blender and just soften up the flicks that are in the sky and on the ground. And then I'm going to dirty this up just a tiny bit. I'm going to press some Distress Oxide ink onto my work surface. I'm using ground espresso, and I watered that down just a bit. I'm using a very fine paintbrush and only picking up a little bit of that ink, and then I'm going to do some splatter detail all over that background to just give it some texture and a little bit more interest since it's so simple. I'll set this panel aside to dry, and once it has, I'm going to pop it into my MISTI so that I can stamp my sentiment. I'm going to use my rich cocoa ink again so everything matches, and I'm going to stamp down the Howdy sentiment that comes with the Little Buckaroos stamp set. I stamped that down twice to get a nice bold impression, and now I'm going to work on the inside of my card. I always like to finish off the inside with an additional image or images and an additional sentiment as well. I just think it brings some of the fun from the outside onto the inside. It gives the recipient a little extra surprise. So I'm using two of the chickens and the sentiment that says "Just Chicken In," which I think is so cute. And I stamped that down with some gray ink on some pale pink cardstock so that it matches with the coloring. And then I've taken another piece of that pale pink cardstock and run that through my die cut machine with the Frilly Frames eyelet lace, just the inner portion of that die. And I didn't bother to punch out all the little holes from the center portion because that's going to get covered up completely with my focal panel. So I'm going to glue that down right over top and just get that nice and lined up where I want it. And then for the outside, I'm actually going to use the Frilly Frames rectangle. And I love how that die cuts those two frames separately, so you can use one or the other. It just gives you lots more options, or you can put them together and use them as one unit like I'm going to do. And to hold those in place, I'm just going to use a little bit of Scotch tape I'm going to add that to each of the 4 corners to kind of hold it in place, and then I'm going to add some foam tape behind the frame, and that's going to hold it together even more. So once I have this last piece in place, you'll be able to see what I mean. I just cut that foam tape down into a thinner strip and place that behind so you can't see any of that. And because it overlaps the cut edge of both of those frames, it just holds everything nice and tight together. So I just line that up and press that down into place. And then to help the focal panel have a little bit more of a finished look, I cut down 2 thin pieces of gray cardstock, and I'm just going to add those to the top and bottom of that focal panel. I'm using my reverse tweezers to help me kind of squeeze that underneath the edge of the frame, and I did have to trim that down just a tiny bit to make that fit. But you can see that just gives it a nice finished edge. Plus it also ties back into the color palette that I went with for today's card. So once everything is framed in, I'm ready to add my images. And this is always my favorite part at the end of the card here, because I get to see the whole story that was in my head come into place on the card front. So I'm going to add all of my images with some foam tape just to give them a little bit more lift and separate them even more from that pale background so the colored images really pop. I'm going to add my little girl over on the right and then the goat to the left of her. I'm going to have her feeding him with that little corn on the cob, so I'll put that in her hand. And then I've got these 2 little pumpkins that I'm going to stack over on the far left. I'm going to tuck the larger one just a tiny bit under the edge of that frame, and then add the smaller one overlapping it just a tiny bit. And that is going to complete my card for today. I decided not to add any embellishments because I thought it had a lot going on already, but I'll give you an up-close look and another peek at the inside. So I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. This one is definitely different from anything I've ever done, but I really love how it turned out, and I hope you do too. If you did, please be sure to hit that like button and subscribe, and don't forget to check out the description bar below the video for links to all of the products used today. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day. Bye-bye.